I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all. And as Buzz Aldrin described it, it was this magnificent desolation.
Imagine being one of only 12 humans to ever stand on another world, looking back at a tiny blue marble while kicking up dust that hasn't moved in a billion years. Charlie Duke did that, but when he came home, the most shocking thing wasn't an alien encounter or a government cover-up. It was the fact that we simply walked away.
Alien life, God showed me a specific answer to two prayers.
Why did we leave the ultimate high ground? The truth is weirder, saltier, and more human than any conspiracy. Ready to find out why the moon went dark?
Central highlands of the moon, we just had a blast. And I was always striving for the next adventure, if you will.
Not going back to the moon. Let's try to grasp the sheer caffeinated madness of how we got there in the first place. This wasn't a slow, logical progression of human discovery. It wasn't a peaceful step for mankind, planned over a century of calm scientific debate. No. The Apollo program was a flat-out, lungs-burning, heart-pounding sprint born out of pure, unadulterated Cold War terror. Think about the vibe in 1961. The United States was essentially losing the coolest tech contest to the Soviet Union. The USSR had already put the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit, and then they doubled down by putting Yuri Gagarin into space while America was still trying to figure out how to keep its rockets from exploding on the launch pad.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to orbit the Earth.
To the average person sitting in a diner in 1962, it felt like the Red Menace owned the sky. In response, President John F. Kennedy didn't just suggest a hobby. He threw down the ultimate gauntlet. We choose to go to the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
But here's the kicker. We didn't actually know how to do it. When Kennedy made that speech, the total amount of time Americans had spent in space was barely enough to watch a feature-length movie. We didn't have the computers. Your toaster has more processing power today. We didn't have the materials, and we definitely didn't have the safety protocols. But we had a deadline, the end of the decade. This created a culture of go, go, go that defined the lives of guys like Charlie Duke. They weren't just pilots. They were essentially test subjects for a giant, explosive physics experiment funded by taxpayers who were terrified of Russian nukes in orbit. The Apollo program was an economic monster. At its peak, NASA was consuming roughly 4% of the entire federal budget. To put that in perspective, if NASA had that kind of money today, they'd be getting something like $250 billion a year instead of the $25 billion they actually get. We were spending money like the world was ending, primarily because we were afraid it actually might. This sprint mentality meant that every decision was made based on speed. Can we make it safer? Maybe. But will it take longer? Yes. Then skip it. We have to beat the Russians. This intensity created a unique breed of astronaut. Charlie Duke and his contemporaries weren't just there for the science. They were military test pilots, men who were comfortable with a 1 in 10 chance of not coming home. When you read Duke's accounts of his training, it sounds less like a classroom and more like a gladiatorial school. They were being dropped into jungles for survival training, spinning in centrifuges until they blacked out, and learning how to fly a lunar module that was essentially a fragile tin-foil origami crane powered by a computer that could barely handle a game of Pong. The sprint also meant that the technology was bespoke. Every bolt, every circuit, and every drop of rocket fuel was part of a singular, custom-built machine. the Saturn V. This rocket remains the most powerful machine humans have ever successfully operated. Standing over 360 feet tall, it was a screaming tower of controlled explosions. But because we were sprinting, we weren't building an infrastructure. We weren't building a highway to the moon. We were building a high-speed, one-use dragster. Once you win the race and cross the finish line, what do you do with a dragster? You park it in the garage and realize you can't afford the insurance anymore. While Duke was preparing for Apollo 16, the cracks in the Sprint were already starting to show. The public, which had been glued to their TV sets for Apollo 11, was already starting to tune out. By the time Duke actually stepped onto the lunar dust in 1972, the race was technically over. We had won. The Soviets had pivoted to space stations, and the American public was starting to ask, why are we spending billions on rocks when there's a war in Vietnam and gas prices are spiking? The tragedy of the Sprint is that it was too successful for its own good.
For a 380-pound guy, that's pretty good. They threw that out.
We moved so fast and spent so much energy that we essentially burned out the engine of public interest. Duke and his crew were the elite athletes at the end of a marathon that everyone else had already stopped watching. They were performing incredible feats of human courage, like Duke's Lunar Olympics, where he nearly killed himself jumping in 1/6 gravity, but the political will that fueled the fire was turning into cold ash. We often look back and ask, why haven't we been back in 50 years? The answer starts here, in the 60s. We didn't go to the moon because it was the logical next step. We went because we were in a panicked, high-speed chase. And the problem with a sprint is that once you catch your breath, you realize you're miles away from home, your pockets are empty, and you've got no way to keep up that pace forever. Charlie Duke saw the moon at the very tail end of this frenzy. He saw the magnificent desolation of the Descartes Highlands, but he also saw a NASA that was already starting to pack its bags. The Saturn V production lines were already being mothballed before he even splashed down in the Pacific. We had the keys to the kingdom, but we were already checking our watches and looking for the exit. It's a classic "be careful what you wish for" scenario. We wanted to be first so badly that we didn't bother to plan for being second or third or 10th. So we had the hero, we had the hardware, and we had the footprint. But the surprising reality Duke lived through was the transition from being a cosmic pioneer to being part of a program that was suddenly too expensive to exist. We didn't stop going because the moon was boring. We stopped because the race was over, and the spectators had already left the stadium. If we had the tech and the talent, what exactly went wrong in the boardroom? The $28 billion hangover. If you want to know why Charlie Duke's boots were some of the last to touch lunar soil, you have to follow the money. In the early 60s, NASA was the golden child. We were throwing money at the moon, like it was a fire that only stacks of $100 bills could extinguish. But by the time Duke actually got his chance to fly in 1972, the vibe in Washington, D.C. had shifted from "let's conquer the heavens" to "how do we pay for all this mess?" The Apollo program cost approximately $28 billion. In today's money, that's north of $280 billion. To a modern ear, that sounds like a lot, but manageable for a superpower. However, the shocking part isn't just the total price tag, it's the percentage of the pie. At its absolute peak, NASA was sucking up nearly 4.4% of the entire U.S. federal budget. Imagine that today. If 4% of every tax dollar went to space, we'd probably have a Starbucks on Mars by now. But that kind of spending is what economists call unsustainable surge pricing. It was a wartime footing without a declared war, and the American taxpayer was starting to feel the pinch. The first big vibe killer for the moon missions was the Vietnam War. While Duke and his buddies were training in simulators, the U.S. was sinking billions of dollars into a grueling, controversial conflict in Southeast Asia. At the same time, President Lyndon B. Johnson was trying to fund his Great Society programs to fight poverty and inequality at home. You had a classic guns versus butter versus moon rocks scenario. Suddenly, spending billions to send a few guys to a dead rock to pick up some gravel started to look like a luxury the country couldn't afford. The public's attention was being pulled in a dozen different directions: civil rights, anti-war protests, and an oil crisis that was about to make everyone's gas bill a nightmare. By 1970, the Nixon administration looked at the ledger and made a cold, hard calculation. The space race was essentially over. We'd beaten the Soviets to the moon multiple times. The point had been proven, and the political clout of another moon landing was diminishing with every mission.
But why was landing a man on the moon so important?
To the politicians, Apollo 11 was a miracle. Apollo 12 was a success. By Apollo 16, it was, are they still doing that? The ratings were dropping, and in politics, low ratings mean a slashed budget. NASA's budget didn't just get a trim, it got a buzz cut. It plummeted from that 4% high down to under 1% in a staggeringly short amount of time. This is where the shocking revelation from guys like Duke really hits home. NASA was forced to cancel the final 3 planned missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, before the rockets were even finished. Think about that. We had already paid for the hardware. The rockets were built. The astronauts were trained. But the operating costs and the political willpower were so depleted that we literally let multi-billion-dollar machines rot in museums rather than spend the extra cash to launch them. This wasn't just about saving a few bucks, though. It was a fundamental shift in philosophy. The government decided that instead of being a pioneer agency that goes to new places, NASA needed to become a trucking agency. They wanted something reusable, something that stayed closer to home, and something that could help the military. This gave birth to the Space Shuttle program. The shuttle was cool, don't get me wrong, but it was a low Earth orbit vehicle. It was designed to go up a few hundred miles, drop off a satellite, and come back. It couldn't go to the moon. By choosing the shuttle, we effectively signed a divorce paper with the moon that would last for half a century. Charlie Duke has often pointed out that the decision to stop wasn't made by scientists. It was made by accountants and pollsters. Humanity's greatest adventure was killed by a spreadsheet. We reached the moon, looked around, and realized that staying there required a financial commitment that the 70s American public just wasn't ready to make. We chose the short-term fix over the long-term vision. We had the keys to the solar system in our hands, but we traded them in for a commuter pass to low Earth orbit because it was cheaper and safer for the political careers of the people in charge. The moon didn't change. We did. We went from a nation that was willing to risk everything for a giant leap to a nation that was worried about the cost of the shoes. And that, more than any alien theory, is why the moon stayed lonely for 50 years. But money wasn't the only thing that turned sour. Have you ever tried to walk through a cloud of glass shards? Death by 1,000. Dust specks. If the politicians were the ones who pulled the plug on the bank account, the moon itself was the one trying to kill the astronauts every single second they were on the clock. When Charlie Duke talks about the reasons we didn't go back, he isn't just talking about the budget. He's talking about how incredibly hostile the lunar environment actually is. We like to imagine the moon as this serene, silver-white playground, but for the guys in the suits, it was more like trying to survive inside a giant vacuum-sealed rock tumbler filled with broken glass. The biggest villain in this story? The dust. To you and me, dust is just the stuff we swipe off our bookshelves. But lunar regolith, the fancy name for moon dust, is a completely different beast. Because there's no wind or water on the moon to erode the edges of particles, Every single grain of dust is as sharp as a tiny shard of obsidian. It's also electrostatic, meaning it clings to everything like literal glitter from hell. Charlie Duke has described how this stuff got into every seal, every zipper, and every moving part of their equipment. By the end of their 3-day stay, the seals on their spacesuits were starting to fail because the dust was literally grinding them down like sandpaper. Duke often recalls the smell of the moon, which is a weird thing to think about since there's no air. But when they climbed back into the lunar module and took off their helmets, they were covered in so much of this gray soot that they couldn't help but inhale it. It smelled like spent gunpowder. It irritated their lungs, it scratched their corneas, and it made the equipment overheat. NASA realized that if we wanted to stay on the moon for weeks instead of days, we'd need to invent entirely new technologies just to deal with the dirt. The moon wasn't just a place, it was a corrosive force. Then, there's the death-defying physics of the place. Because the gravity is only 1/6 of what we have on Earth, your brain and your body get into a constant argument about where your center of gravity is. This led to one of the most heart-stopping moments in Charlie Duke's life, the Lunar Olympics. Feeling a bit cocky at the end of their mission, Duke decided to see how high he could jump for the camera. He leaped up, but because his heavy life support system, the big backpack, shifted his weight, he flipped over in midair. He fell backward from several feet up, landing squarely on his oxygen tank. If that tank had cracked, or his suit had ripped, he would have been dead before his commander could even reach him. In his own words, it was the only time he truly felt his heart stop. NASA's mission control went silent. It was a terrifying reminder that on the moon, a simple stumble isn't just embarrassing. It's a potential funeral. We also have to talk about the long night. A single day on the moon lasts about 2 weeks, followed by 2 weeks of total darkness. During the day, the temperature can soar to 127 degrees Celsius, hot enough to boil water instantly. At night, it drops to a bone-shattering -173 degrees Celsius. Our Apollo hardware was only designed to survive the morning period of the lunar day. To build a base that could survive the lunar night, we would have needed nuclear power plants or massive batteries that didn't exist in 1972. When you combine the corrosive dust, the radiation from solar flares, the extreme temperature swings, and the fact that a simple fall could kill you, NASA's safety officers started to have second thoughts. They realized that every time we sent a crew like Duke's, we were rolling the dice. With the public already losing interest, the risk versus reward ratio was completely out of whack. If we had lost a crew on the moon during Apollo 18 or 19, it would have probably ended the American space program forever. We weren't really conquering the moon, we were barely surviving it. Charlie Duke left his footprints and his family photo there, but he also left with a profound respect for how much the moon wants to remain empty. It's a beautiful, desolate, and incredibly dangerous place that requires more than just guts to inhabit. It requires a level of protection we simply hadn't invented yet. If we had the blueprints and the know-how once, shouldn't it be easy to just build another rocket and go back? Well, it turns out we didn't just lose the will, we lost the recipe. The ghost in the machine. One of the most frustrating questions Charlie Duke gets asked is, if you guys did it with 60s technology, why can't we just do it again tomorrow? It's a logical question. Your smartphone has millions of times more computing power than the Apollo guidance computer. We have 3D printers, carbon fiber, and AI. So, where's the holdup? The answer Duke often hints at is a phenomenon called technological regression. We didn't just stop going to the moon, we literally forgot how to build the machines that took us there. Saturn V rocket wasn't just a product. It was an ecosystem. When NASA shut down the Apollo program, they didn't just put the rockets in a garage and keep the keys. They dismantled the entire assembly line. The specialized factories that forged the massive F-1 engines were repurposed or demolished. The companies that held the specific subcontracts for the thousands of tiny, bespoke parts went out of business or moved on to making washing machines and fighter jets. By the time we decided we wanted to go back, the recipe was gone. People often imagine there's a giant dusty filing cabinet at NASA HQ labeled "How to Build a Moon Rocket" with all the blueprints inside. And while the literal blueprints do exist, they are essentially useless. Why? Because those blueprints were designed for a world that no longer exists. They call for materials that are no longer manufactured because they've been replaced by better but different versions. They rely on hand-soldered circuits that were built by thousands of highly skilled workers whose specific trade has been extinct for 40 years. Think of it like trying to build a 60s Ferrari from scratch today. Even if you have the original drawings, you can't buy the exact same grade of steel, the same leaded paint, or the same rubber for the tires. You'd have to reinvent the entire manufacturing process just to make one part. But the hardware is only half the problem. The bigger ghost in the machine is the institutional knowledge. During the Apollo era, there were about 400,000 people working on the project. These engineers, technicians, and seamstresses who literally hand-sewed the spacesuits had tribal knowledge. They knew exactly how much to tighten a specific bolt or how a certain valve felt when it was working correctly. This kind of hands-on expertise can't be captured in a manual. When the funding was slashed after Duke's mission, those 400,000 people were laid off. They took their secrets to the grave or to retirement homes. As Charlie Duke has pointed out, by the time NASA started talking about a return to the moon in the 2000s, almost everyone who had actually worked on Apollo was gone. We had to start from scratch. This is why the Artemis program has taken so long and cost so much. We aren't returning to the moon. We are discovering it for the first time all over again with modern tools. There's also the analog versus digital trap. The Apollo computers were so simple that they were almost impossible to glitch in the way modern software does. They were hardwired. Today, our systems are infinitely more complex, which ironically makes them more fragile in a deep space environment. A single stray cosmic ray can flip a bit in a modern processor and crash a ship. The Apollo tech was rugged, simple, and most importantly, already flight-proven. When we threw that away, we threw away decades of certainty. Charlie Duke lived through the peak of human engineering capability, only to watch it evaporate. It's a sobering reminder that progress isn't a straight line. Sometimes, humanity takes a giant leap, looks around, and then realizes it forgot how to stick the landing. We became a civilization that had the blueprints for a cathedral, but lost the ability to carve the stone. We had to wait for a new generation of digital stonemasons to come along and figure out a new way to build. The truth is that for about 30 years, if the president had ordered NASA to go to the moon by the end of the week, the answer would have been a flat no. Not because we didn't want to, but because we physically couldn't. The ghost of the Saturn V was a haunting reminder that if you don't use a technology, you lose it. If the old way is dead and the recipes are lost, how is the new space race actually going to work? The Return of the King. If you're looking for an update to Charlie Duke's story, look no further than your news feed from last Friday. On April 10, 2026, The silence of the deep woods was replaced by the cheers of a global audience as the Artemis II crew, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, successfully splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. This wasn't just another splashdown, it was the definitive proof that the 50-year hangover is officially over. For the first time since Duke and the crew of Apollo 17 left the Moon in 1972, humans have returned to lunar space. The Artemis II mission was a 10-day masterclass in modern engineering. Launched on April 1, 2026, aboard the Space Launch System, SLS, the spiritual and much more advanced successor to the Saturn V, the crew pushed their spacecraft, Integrity, further than any human-rated vehicle has ever gone. On day 6 of their mission, they reached a staggering 252,756 miles from Earth, officially shattering the record set by the Apollo 13 crew back in 1970. But this mission wasn't just about breaking records, it was about fixing the safety wall that Duke once feared. Unlike the Apollo capsules, which were essentially all-or-nothing machines, the Orion spacecraft used for Artemis is a tank. It's equipped with advanced radiation shielding, which the crew actually practiced assembling during a mid-flight shelter construction demo, and a high-tech launch abort system designed to save the crew at any stage of the flight. We're no longer rolling the dice with test pilots. We're flying a highly calibrated, data-driven machine. The vibe on board Integrity was also worlds away from the military-only atmosphere of the 60s. The 2026 crew made history not just for where they went, but for who they are. Christina Koch became the first woman to witness an Earthrise from the Moon's far side, while Victor Glover became the first person of color to travel into deep space. Even the Canadian Space Agency got a seat at the table with Jeremy Hansen, making it a truly international homecoming. During their lunar flyby, they even spotted 2 new craters, asking NASA for permission to name one Carol in honor of Commander Wiseman's late wife, a human touch that Duke, who left his own family photo on the dust, would surely appreciate. So why did it take so long to get here? Because, as we discussed, we had to reinvent everything. The SLS rocket is built on a sustainable model, using evolved versions of space shuttle engines and solid rocket boosters, but integrated into a deep space configuration that can push 95 tons of cargo. We had to learn how to communicate at lunar distances again using the Deep Space Network, which reacquired the crew's signal just as they emerged from behind the Moon on April 6th. The Moon is no longer a distant mystery. It's a construction site. While Duke was part of the crew that visited, the Artemis II crew were the inspectors checking the foundation for the house we're about to build. With the success of this mission, NASA and its partners are now accelerating toward Artemis III, a mission slated for mid-2027 that will finally see boots back on the ground. We've spent 50 years looking at the Moon through telescopes and grainy Apollo footage. But as of this month, we have high-definition photos taken by astronauts poking camera lenses through the windows of a 21st-century spacecraft. But a flyby is just a drive-by. If we really want to stay, we have to solve the one problem that defeated Apollo. How do you live in a place that's trying to kill you? Sustaining the unstoppable. The final twist in this 50-year saga isn't just that we're going back, it's that we're finally moving in. If Charlie Duke was a lone scout, the astronauts of 2026 are the urban planners. The reason the Moon stayed lonely for half a century was because we were treating it like a sacred museum. Today, we're treating it like an 8th continent waiting to be settled. The linchpin of this new era is the Artemis Base Camp, a concept that fundamentally changes the math of space travel. Unlike the Apollo missions, which had to carry every drop of water and every breath of air from Earth at a staggering cost, The base camp is designed for in situ resource utilization. This is the scientific way of saying we are finally going to live off the land. Located at the lunar South Pole near the Shackleton crater, this future outpost targets the holy grail of space exploration: water ice hidden in permanently shadowed craters. By mining this ice, we aren't just getting a drink for the crew. We are creating liquid hydrogen for rocket fuel and oxygen for breathing. This is the shift from a spending mindset to an investing mindset. By turning the moon into a cosmic gas station, we make the journey to Mars a realistic possibility rather than a sci-fi dream. The architecture for this permanent stay is already rolling out in the late 2020s, featuring pressurized rovers that act like mobile campers and small fission reactors, no bigger than a household trash can that provide constant power through the freezing, 2-week lunar night. The goal is to reach a steady cadence of landings that transforms the moon from a place we visit into a place we inhabit. Charlie Duke famously left a photo of his family in the lunar dust as a symbolic gesture of a man who knew he could never stay. Today's astronauts are bringing something much more permanent: blueprints for a backyard. We finally answered the shocking question of why we never went back. We didn't just need better rockets or more money. We needed a reason to stay. Now that we've found it, using the moon as a training ground for the stars beyond, the door is finally, permanently, open. The sprint is over. The settlement has begun. Comment our thoughts below, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next revelation.